Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Leis. I'm your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, and I want to welcome you to our live discussion today on X and also YouTube. So, a warm welcome to our audience, and we're looking forward to hearing your comments and your questions about our important topic today as we discuss the invocation of the Emergency Measures Act. And of course, the big news that on January the 23rd, it was ruled by a federal judge that it was unconstitutional, it was against the law. And so we'll talk about both that Emergency Act and its implications a little bit with our special guest, but also we're going to talk about the Coutts Four, um, the four gentlemen who were arrested without bail a long time ago, some 725 days, I believe, approximately, that were held in prison. And so we're going to talk about that case as well. So I am delighted to welcome our special guest today, senior fellow with the Frontier Center, Ray McGinnis. Ray is both an author, he's written several books, and I encourage you to look him up, and also a lot of articles and analysis about many issues, including the issues that we're going to talk about today. So, a warm welcome to you, Ray.
Great to be speaking with you and back on your show, David.
Well, Ray, we're glad you could join us because these are big times. And I'll start off with the decision that was made by the court, Justice Mosley, on January 23rd, saying that the use of the Emergencies Act was illegal. It was unconstitutional. So, what was your reaction? Were you surprised by that decision, Ray?
I was surprised. I knew that there was a civil, a challenge to the government, and that was reported back in February 2023 that there was going to be this challenge by these several groups and individuals, and that there was going to be some sort of a hearing back in April of 2023. But really, it was not, whatever happened in terms of the lawyers and witnesses speaking before the judge, that wasn't being reported by the press hardly at all. And so all of a sudden, out comes this decision on the 23rd of January, and I was surprised. And given the numerous court decisions that have where judges have tapped their sails to the orthodoxy of the day, I was surprised that here was a judge that was refreshingly scrutinizing the claims of government and finding the government, in this case, overreached and violated the Constitution.
Indeed. So it was a historic decision, and we're going to go through a little bit of the rationales in a moment. But Ray, you have written about this time extensively, this moment in history where the truckers' convoy, the Freedom Convoy, made its way across the country to Ottawa. Can you kind of refresh our memory? Because it's hard to believe that it's some time ago that all this event occurred. Can you kind of just summarize where the truckers' convoy began and kind of how it ended up in Ottawa?
So the protest in question, the catalyst was the Canadian government's decision that truck drivers would all need to be vaccinated to enter Canada. And of course, if you're not vaccinated, then there could be, a particular customs agent might refuse a truck driver entering Canada, or they would require them to perhaps be quarantined for 10 to 14 days. And of course, if you're just going on a driving from Toronto to Buffalo with a load of cargo to a furniture store, then you get back to the Niagara Falls border, and you're told you're going to be in quarantine for 14 days, or you can't cross back in. That's not viable for a truck driver to make a living. You can't be going across the border and then not being allowed to work and have to be under, basically in your home for 2 weeks. You get to drive across the border twice a month. That's not going to make a living. And also this was fairly unique in all the world. Truck drivers were driving many countries, regardless of their particular restrictions for ordinary citizens, across the globe, truck drivers were given an exemption, as the Prime Minister had for a long time into this in Canada, because truck drivers are driving products across borders to help with the economy and to secure a strong supply chain. And so, truck drivers across Europe and truck drivers across into South America and Southeast Asia were driving across borders without any problem. But in Canada, even though there was a health committee meeting of Parliament in January, where Health Minister Duclos and Dr. Theresa Tam spoke to the Health Committee of Parliament, and they said that there was no data that they had to show that truck drivers were spreading COVID. So all of this was a catalyst then for people, not just truck drivers, but truck drivers spearheaded this, to go to Ottawa and say, where's the beef? Why should there be this kind of a requirement? Plus,
So in that context, Ray, it's I think a lot of this detail is fascinating, and I'm so glad that you have a great handle on it. Is that, to be clear, the imposition of that kind of mandate on this particular group of people who spent so much of their time in, what is it again? Their cab,
yeah.
was not, like, to this day, we don't have any information or health data that supports that invocation. And so this was a direct assault on their way of making a living. Um, so it's very curious then. So, in retrospect, looking back at this, Ray, is it clear in your mind that this was not a health public policy that was, used to try to protect people? It was really, was it more of a political initiative, a kind of a wedge issue designed to kind of advance the government's political narrative, or to their advantage? So it wasn't policy; it was more of a political tactic. Am I being too cynical, Ray?
No, on the 24th of November at the Public Order Emergency Commission, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland conceded that the push to get truck drivers to be vaccinated was done as to signal to all of the unvaccinated 5 to 6 million Canadians that they should also get vaccinated too. So it was a kind of a coercive measure to get everybody else on board, regardless of their profession, who had not yet been vaccinated. And I want to add
So,
significantly that I did not know this at the time, but deep in the labyrinth of Health Canada's website, you can find a place where it indicates the number of people who they concede have been vaccinated and then had a vaccine injury. And around
mhm.
the time of January of 2022, there were over 100 people that Health Canada was conceding had actually died after getting this vaccine. So it wasn't, this wasn't generally public knowledge at the time. I didn't know that, but here you have the insistence of the government that people can go ahead and get a, quote, safe and effective vaccine. And there are some people who are getting it and who are actually dying as a consequence of that decision.
Okay, so within this context, Ray, we had the convoy sweep across the country from all directions. And even before they made it to Ottawa, we had the most senior officials in the government labeling them, I would use the word demonizing them, as people with unacceptable views. That was already happening before they got to Ottawa. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. And there were people in the Prime Minister's office and connected with Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino's office with text messages, maybe emails too, going back and forth prior to the Liberal cabinet retreat on, I think, the 24th of January, bouncing around ideas about framing the protesters as a January 6th North, as white supremacists and racists and so on. So, there was a bit of steam and, people excited that they had certain people who were reporters with CTV or Global or CBC that would surely be happy to join in on the characterization of the protesters quite a few days before they even arrived in Ottawa.
Wow. So it is really remarkable that you had this kind of characterization happen. You had people arrive in Ottawa, the truckers, and they immediately you had all kinds of stories circulating that they were up to untoward activity, like there was food being stolen from a food bank. You had all kinds of things about people being assaulted. You had the placement of a Nazi flag. I mean, it was really quite bizarre. And at the same time, you had all kinds of peaceful protests happening. You even had the setting up of food areas where they were serving food to all kinds of people. It's almost like a kind of a street party atmosphere, even with jumping castles to boot. So within that context, I am amazed by the differences in telling of story between what was on the ground and what was going on in the media. It was really, really something. And I still remember when the late Leon Fontaine actually sent a group from Bridge City News all the way to Ottawa, and they actually reported this, and they were going after the good, bad, and the ugly on the ground, and they just found a complete contrast. So, I mean, you must have made the same observations, Ray, that there was just a complete contrast between what the media was saying and what was happening on the ground.
There was, and I mean, thankfully, I mean, I stumbled upon reporter Rupa Subramanya, who has been writing for the National Post at the time, and she is an Indo-Canadian woman of color reporter who lived just 5 minute walk from Parliament Hill, and she talked about having all this stuff in her head about the portrayal of these depiction of these people coming to Ottawa. So
Hmm.
she was curious to see what was happening, and she interviewed, I think, over 150 people, uh, numerous people of color, as many women, even though the protest was depicted as misogynist. And she, as a person of color, says she never encountered a single incident of misogyny or racism or white supremacist, and neither did many of the women or persons of color or other or Caucasians that she interviewed. This was not reflected at all what was happening. I heard a young man whose mother was glued to the CTV, I think, and very afraid for her Afro-Canadian son who was involved in managing a fitness club. And he said, "Well, Mom, you should come down and see this, and I promise we'll leave immediately if you feel uncomfortable." And so they were down for some hours, and he said afterwards, how do you feel? And she said, "I can't believe what I'm hearing on the news. These people are so friendly." So, this is a huge disconnect. Stories about, threats to bomb a children's hospital, uh, people associated allegedly with the protest who are trying to set fire clumsily to, arson a residential building, and that proved not to be true. So there's a whole litany of everything but the kitchen sink that was, laid on and piled on day after day after day. And after it's all said and done, the people who are front and center in the ongoing story, set aside the Coutts for, uh, Tamara Leach and Chris Barber are on an ongoing trial, and it's going to be 35 days coming into March for mischief. If they had found a single person in Ottawa who actually had been violent, physically violent, you can bet that that person and their face would be all over the front pages of all kinds of papers and media outlets from coast to coast unendingly. But that didn't
No,
happen.
I think you're absolutely right, Ray. So in that context, and it's good that you brought up our friend Rupa Subramanya. and her covering of it, because I think those are seminal moments where there were enough voices within the media to counteract really what was the dominant narrative to try to portray the truckers as a bunch of quote people of unacceptable views, white supremacists, and the whole bit. When in fact, so many of them were people of color. I mean, it's just utterly bizarre. So one of the things that did come into effect then was, and I do remember this history well, was things were wrapping up. There was a kind of a set of agreements and good working relationships between the protesters and police. They were working together. And there was even agreements around limiting honking, as I recall. I mean, um, people were starting to move out. Um, so help us understand, Ray, the days just before the invocations of the Emergency Act, because we recall that there was the blockade on the Ambassador Bridge, and then that was broken up several days before February 14th. That's the anniversary date, a Valentine's Day of all things. Um, but help us bring alive that time leading up to the invocations of the act.
So there was, yes, there was a protest in Windsor, and the blockade at the Ambassador Bridge was cleared by late on the evening of the 13th, and through the regular laws that police are allowed to exercise. There
Mm-hmm.
was protests in Coutts with some serious, well, actually, with the charges that were being laid in Coutts against the four men in particular, were initially just mischief charges on the night of the 13th and the early morning hour of the 14th and noon on the 14th for one man, Jerry Morin, who was heading west from Calgary to Pritis to do some work for a rancher. But their charges of conspiracy to commit murder only were laid, later in the afternoon, just before the Prime Minister invoked the Emergencies Act. And then in Ottawa itself, you have the successful negotiations, hush-hush negotiations between key volunteers with the protest and the city of Ottawa. And by noon on the day of the invocation, the protesters, well, the city of Ottawa, they're taking photos of each license plate of each truck that's leaving the downtown area. I think between 100 and 120 had already left by noon, and the schedule of removing all of the vehicles, 75% of the vehicles was the plan by the end of the 16th of February, was proceeding smoothly. And then all of a sudden, the protesters were being stopped by police and couldn't move their vehicles out, on the 15th. And Steve Kanalakis with the city of Ottawa was, quote, blindsided by the federal government seeming to intervene and stop the removal of vehicles.
Just a sec, can you just clarify that, Ray? Because I don't want to bury that one. Are you saying that at one point, as the trucks were withdrawing from Ottawa, there was intervention on behalf of the federal government to actually stop them from leaving Ottawa before they used the Emergencies Act?
Well, no, the the Emergencies Act was invoked 4:30 or so on Valentine's Day the 14th, but you continue to have what's happening as the protesters and the city of Ottawa continue to try and get more vehicles, rolling out of the city, you know, into the 15th, the following day of the Emergencies Act. Then you have, police, the Parliamentary Protective Service, and so on, are now preventing vehicles from leaving the city. Which is what you'd want to have done. I want to also remind your viewers that when the protesters were arriving, they thought that they were all going to be up on the Johnny MacDonald Parkway and George Etienne Cartier, if I've got the name right, So about 2,500 vehicles, trucks would be up there, and that there was going to be shuttles from those locations where foot passengers would be walking around. There wouldn't have been anybody on Wellington Street at all. However, the police in Ottawa directed each vehicle, no, you park here, you go on this street, you go on Kent Street, and so on. So all of this, as has come out in both the Public Order Emergency Commission, and the trial for Tamara Leach and Chris Barber, makes very clear that the truck drivers and other vehicles were going to their locations in the downtown Ottawa area because the police were waving them forward and pointing to where they should stop and park their vehicle.
Exactly. So this background is all very relevant because you can kind of understand better this decision. And so part of the context here is that, and I should just remind everybody, I'm talking with Ray McGinnis, a senior fellow with Frontier, about in the use of the Emergency Measures Act and the Coutts 4. So please bring on your questions, your comments. We're curious what you think about this important point in Canada's history and what it means to you. Um, so Ray, just picking up those threads then, um, it's curious. So the truckers come into Ottawa. They are directed by police to go in certain parts of the city, and then later, as things are coming to a close, the act is used, the Emergency Act, which is supposedly kind of a sledgehammer of legislation to be used only in last resort in a national emergency. And what I find fascinating is that before that, one of the key requests of the protest was to meet with officials. And people know that I was formerly a mayor, and it would be typical business to meet with people that were had concerns about issues or protesters and sit down and civilly have a discussion. But they never met with their protesters. Is there ever any record as to why they would not meet with people who had really put everything on the line in terms of their livelihood and everything to come to Ottawa, that no one would sit down and actually have a civil conversation, Ray?
No, and I think even the Attorney General of Ottawa at one point had asked, I think if I've got the right person, or the Deputy Attorney General of Ottawa had said it would be a good idea if if some representatives from the government, not necessarily the Prime Minister, but some representative would meet with them to discuss things, not necessarily even to agree, but to have a conversation, which is a long-standing tradition going way back to the 19,
Mhm.
to the 19th century. So, and you even have recommendations by police in the Ottawa Police Service and police and the Ontario Provincial Police, saying we should do the same thing as what happened when there had been about 11-week strike with people protesting on rail lines in 2020, from early January until around the 20th of March of 2020. There were all kinds of protests, and some highways shut down in Ontario, and rail lines, freight service, passenger service, all disrupted for all this time. And throughout that protest, the Prime Minister's attitude was, well, we need to understand these people and negotiate with them. So, but in 2022, the attitude was, these people are too reprehensible to even have a discussion with, or they're impossible to discuss, or we can't figure out who we would have a discussion with, which is even stranger given that people like Tamara Leach were being reported in the news. And and then you have people like Chrystia Freeland's saying she, almost acting as if she hardly knows who Tamara Leach might be, and when she's testifying before the Public Order Emergency Commission, it's too cute to believe.
So within that context, it really is hard to believe that there was no discussions with this protesters, and as time moves on, they use the Emergencies Act. They do kind of a systematic clearing of people on the ground as well that did stay. And we also had the freezing of bank accounts with the people who gave money towards the protests. It was really quite a it sent shockwaves around the world as people saw both the images in Ottawa of a certain type of almost like a militarized police force, paramilitary move in to clear Ottawa, but also it sent shockwaves really around the whole banking community around the world that Canada would actually freeze people's bank accounts. Were there other key highlights that you remember from that history as well, Ray?
Well, and around this time too, I mean, noise violations, I want to say, I mean, no one wants to hear a car alarm or a horn honking, understandably. Uh, and uh, and that keeps coming up and was mentioned by numbers of people, like, there was noise. But a provincial judge, McLean, ruled on the 7th of February that the honking had to stop, and the protesters agreed, and they had block captains. And if there was a rogue truck driver honking occasionally uh, after the 7th, they would be warned, "We're going to cut your air horn, buddy, or else you stop honking, or we're going to cut your air horn." And it stopped. And even Zexi Lee at the Public Order Emergency Commission, is one of the key Ottawa residents, conceded that basically there was hardly any honking after the 7th of February. So for people to say, well, they had to invoke the Emergencies Act to stop the honking, that honking had stopped a week before the invocation. So, and also there are other, you could say legitimately the city of Ottawa, it could have declared a curfew. They could have, there's a number of things that they could have done. And one of the things you do before the last resort of invoking the Emergencies Act is you can call in the army. But Justice Rouleau in his report said, well, that's what the Emergencies Act said in the legislation back in 1988, and times have changed. Well, nothing has changed except perhaps the size of the Canadian military, which has shrunk a bit. But otherwise, the Canadian military remain available and were available for the Prime Minister to call in on the 14th if he felt that that was important, which would have been, and other things in the criminal code were also available to the RCMP and so on. So for the government to reach for this, what has now been shown to be unconstitutional hammer, is a stain on Canada, and the emergent and the freezing of some, I gather, 280 individuals' bank accounts was all done. Justice Mosley found in his judicial review, was all done on an ad hoc basis. It was, and you had people whose bank accounts were frozen that were not even in Ottawa protesting.
Utterly bizarre. Um, okay, so let's move forward here, and this is a little bit confusing because we have the decision by the federal court calling this invocation or use of the act as illegal. Full stop, period. It's a brilliant decision. I recommend everybody read it if you can. And Ray has done some really good analysis, but make sure you look the Platon, the main heroes that brought this case forward were the Canadian Constitution Foundation, of course, the Canadian Civil Liberties Foundation. So they deserve kudos for really bringing this case forward, and bravo on them. And I did have um, uh, Joanna Barron on from the Canadian Constitution Foundation the other week to discuss this. So be sure to look at that. But in this context, the ruling was very clear. This was no national emergency within the meaning of the act. It should only be used as a last resort. There were no threats to the security of Canada, and I think many intelligence police officials testified to that. Um, there was no economic harm as part of the threshold that would invoke the act. I mean, the decision is really, I think, a slam dunk in terms of it being illegal. But what's confusing I think maybe to some Canadians, is that prior to this decision was a judicial review of sorts as required by the act. So if you, within the act, if a government would use it, you'd also have to have a review of it. And that was undertaken in Ottawa last year. And you actually attended a number of the hearings. And that was kind of, I would refer to it politely as a muddled decision because it said, well, rational decision makers, if I recall it correctly, could kind of come out on either way. They could say it was inappropriate or it was appropriate. So it was kind of a, and maybe it's because of the particular judge that went through that process. But how do you reconcile the difference between this federal court's decision that is law versus the other kind of muddled review that was done? Like, how
Yeah.
do you square that circle, Ray, or can't you?
Now, and let me just add the chronology is the Emergencies Act requires within 60 days of the Prime Minister set up an inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act. And that inquiry ran for, had 76 witnesses over 6 weeks, and then a week of a panel discussing constitutional issues. And that ran from mid-October into early December of 2022. And then they came out, with their decision, their report on the 17th of February 2023. And Justice Rouleau listened incredibly to all 76 witnesses, all of the police and intelligence, all at different points during their cross-examination, said that it was a family-friendly atmosphere, not a threat to passerby. Numbers of the police intelligence witnesses said, like Patrick Morris and Thomas Carrick, that they were really astonished and troubled by the disconnect between the intelligence that they were gathering on the ground of how it wasn't violent, how it wasn't racist, and all of these things. And yet they would be providing intelligence, and that would go up to the chain. And then suddenly someone like Marco Mendocino, the public safety minister, Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister, would be depicting the protests in ways that were unrecognizable to the people who were themselves providing the intelligence that would go to cabinet for them to say something to the press. So,
And as I recall, those ministers would actually say, "We're getting this from intelligence authority." So in fact, the receipts they don't seem to support that line at all, do they?
well, this is the cleverness of it, because yes, the cabinet minister can say, "We've received intelligence reports," and then the viewers of the newscast can infer that having received the intelligence reports, that the minister and the cabinet in question is telling the press what the reports say. But then they go on to say something that's 180 degrees in the opposite direction, and the impressionable public will not know that they've been hoodwinked by a misrepresentation, to put it mildly, of what's going on. And so you have all of this testimony, and then you have Paul Rouleau in his 2,100 or so page report, which I think was certainly written in record time, in 9 weeks or so, with the help of unnamed people who were not credited. He will wave away the very clear statements of these intelligence and police officials on the witness stand, and instead prefer to reframe the word violence. That violence now can be expanded to mean not physical violence, not criminal code violence, not like somebody punched somebody in the jaw and they were arrested, but now it's psychological violence. And so he looks to a couple of the Ottawa residents who talked about phantom honking, like after a week, or more of the honking, some witnesses could still recall the honking like it was yesterday. But and that's but that's not violence. I mean, but he does that kind of thing, and so
Yeah.
and so he says reasonable people could disagree with his conclusions,
Mm.
and they could in spades, because his conclusions don't he's written a report where he's had all these witnesses. They've said a lot of things that completely undercut the government's narrative, and yet the Public Order Emergency Commission report gives a high five to the government, although Rouleau says he did it reluctantly. So
Yeah, no,
it's a
I think
whitewash.
that's a brilliant summation, Ray, of that. And I think Rouleau, in my humble opinion, did enormous damage to the credibility of that kind of government process. So, on a related note, then, we have the Coutts Four, who can you just set up the background on that one, and as we look to the recent release of two of them, and but if can you give us the background of that one? And there's a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah, so you've got four men who are arrested variously on the evening of the 13th of February 2022. Chris Lysek, who is an electrician. You've got Tony Oleanic, who's arrested as well that evening. And then later that night, Chris Carbert is arrested while he's sleeping in a trailer. And remember that the charges are that these four men at the Coutts blockade across from Montana border are plotting to the four of them are plotting to have like a standoff with and shoot police officers, the RCMP. Now there are over 50 police cruisers, so over 100 RCMP officers on the ground at the Coutts blockade. There's just four of these guys, and even and you've got Jerry Moran the next day. I mean, you'd think if he's like a part of what Brenda Lucki, RCMP commissioner at the time, was saying, that there's this hardened cell of people that are armed. Now, Jerry Moran's the fourth who gets arrested, and he's driving. He's a lineman, and he's driving on a work project to go to a ranch west of Calgary in the noon hour the following day, on the 14th of February, when he gets arrested by a SWAT team. Now, and also I want to say, like, Jerry Moran, I've heard various different reports, but he certainly had been working on Vancouver Island till about the 9th the 9th or 10th of February. The four of these men, two of them were classmates from public school, Chris Carbert and Chris Lysek, but the four of them, given Jerry Moran being over on Vancouver Island till about the 9th or 10th of February, had never met each other as a foursome until around just before the final weekend of the protests in Coutts. But we're told to believe that the four of them got together on some street or in a saloon in Coutts and said, why don't we have a standoff with 100 police officers? And what they had were basically hunting rifles. So then the RCMP had a photo of a cruiser with all of these weapons precariously leaning on a table, quite a few of them, not at all properly bagged and everything else. But nonetheless, it looked like a scary photo, and it was a catalyst for many people at the Public Order Emergency Commission who were in the cabinet or senior government officials, like the national advisor to the Prime Minister, security advisor to the Prime Minister, Jody Thomas, to say, well, see, we've got these four guys who are arrested in Coutts, and it's a sign of people trying to overthrow the government. So apparently we were told at the time that the Crown had compelling evidence to show that there was this conspiracy to commit murder, and that they also had that these four had other people who were in other provinces who were like the puppet masters of this whole conspiracy. And since the 14th of February, nobody else, at least to anyone in the public, there's been no public announcement by the RCMP. Oh, by the way, these are the names of the following people who we've also knocked on the door and interviewed to see if they were involved in a larger conspiracy with these four men. And then all of a sudden, after being denied bail for several of them, like even twice, like Chris Carbert, they're too dangerous to release from custody, denied bail for basically 2 years. And then all of a sudden on the 6th of February, after Chris Leis gets crowdfunding in November and gets finally a good lawyer, not just a legal aid lawyer who's not the best, finally gets a lawyer to challenge the Crown and say, with a charter, I think a Section 8 application for the charter, say, well, what is it about? Were these search warrants and wiretaps legal? And then all of a sudden, the Crown drops all of the charges against Chris Lysak and also Jerry Morin, and comes up with new, relatively minor firearms charges, like, well, you forgot, you should have locked that gun, in a locked door, and it wasn't properly stored or something. So how is it that the Crown, this is as serious as the FLQ crisis in terms of the last time. The War Measures Act, the child of the War Measures Act is the Emergencies Act, and the FLQ crisis involved, the murder of one politician and the kidnapping of another, and it was very serious. And so this is also very serious too. And so did the Crown really have solid evidence at all? Otherwise it would seem to see justice done if these four actually were seriously, could be tried and convicted. You would think that the Crown would want to soldier on and take it to trial and put their case before the public, and then have them all convicted if that's what the Crown thinks. But it didn't take much for the Crown to suddenly fold their cards with the two. The other two, Chris Carbert and
So
Tony Oleanic, are going to be on at a hearing on the 20th of February, just coming up.
Okay, so that hearing is coming up for the other two on the 20th, so stay tuned. In the meantime, you actually wrote a piece on this on the Frontier website regarding the release of the two of the Coutts prisoners. So I encourage people to look at that article if they have an opportunity to do that. So I do have a question from the audience, and that is, so were these four, were they actually dangerous, or were they a public threat to public safety then, in your estimation, Ray?
Well, three of these are all working, gravel operator, electrician, lineman. I forget the other one, but they're, none of them, three of the four are fathers, young to teenage children. None of them have criminal records. One of them had a minor thing with somebody, getting into a fight in a bar where the other person maybe started the fight. But in any event, this is not like ISIS or some sort of a terrorist group. So the portrayal of these four men, and in light of the Crown dropping these serious charges, most serious charges for the two, the moment there was any pushback from a lawyer that knew how to really scrutinize, like the Crown's been able to go through this whole 2 years without providing full disclosure to the defense about what the case against their clients is. So it's we have a system of justice in Canada. I've sadly found where 9 out of 10 people who are arrested and charged with a crime will agree to a plea deal, so it will never go to trial. Now that's not good in a system where police think, we don't really have to gather all of our evidence. We don't have to take all the witness statements or go and find out what we need to cross our T's and dot our I's, because there's a chance that 9 times out of 10 the people who are charged here in the case of the Coutts 4 will probably give up eventually. I mean, Jerry Morin on and off was in solitary confinement for 74 days. What does it take in terms of putting enough pressure on an individual who's not able to make any living, who's got bills to pay for their home, or there's all kinds of things. If you're just put in limbo for 2 years, treatment, denial of medications, all kinds of little things and large things, drip, 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 that add to the pressure of making it optimal for somebody who's been charged to plead to something, so the Crown can say, well, we got a guilty plea, even if it has nothing to do with the original charges.
Well, so in this context, Ray, obviously it's hard to know fully the answer to that question, but I think what you're doing is really pointing to the context that says, wow, it seems very doubtful that these people, these so-called suspects, were really worthy of these kinds of charges. And then to be put in, in really prison for some 720 days plus is just an extraordinary, without bail, like they're held under lock and key. It's just, I've never seen this before, to my knowledge. Have you?
No, and for a number of them, like in these remand centers, which are never set up for people to be in custody, for 2 years. I
Hmm.
think a number of them, if I have this right, were not even allowed to go outdoors through all this time.
Hmm.
I mean,
So,
except they could go outdoors if they were being taken, to the
mhm,
Lethbridge courthouse for an appearance, and they would taken out of the
mhm,
van and in shackles and go off to the courthouse.
yeah,
But otherwise, they're indoors the whole time. So all
yeah,
all of this, and I think again, the Crown would not be dropping their charges against the two men who are now out, have been released without conditions, if they didn't have something solid. Because if you have a conspiracy to commit murder and another
mhm,
associated plot to overthrow the government, uh, I don't see why a Crown that thought that they had a solid case to convict would just shrug and say, well,
mhm.
as long as we get a minor firearms charge, off you go.
Yeah. No, let's be real. So, if we look at the bigger picture now, because this is very important history, we're doing this program for a reason. It's the anniversary, like 2 days after Valentine's Day, with the original use or invocation of the Emergencies Act, and then you have this whole exercise. If we look at the history, we're kind of connecting the dots, saying what really happened here. What do we learn from this train wreck of a fiasco where your government doesn't meet with the protesters? They seem to vilify them. They clearly did many things that were illegal, as per the federal court's decision saying its use was illegal. How do we learn from this? Was this kind of like an exercise where the government cynically used a political wedge issue and they didn't manage it well, and they just kept using the media, the mainstream media, to really move forward a set of messages that weren't really grounded in evidence or good public policy? Like what the heck happened here, Ray?
Well, I think that a lesson that we've learned as a society is that many of our fellow citizens, well, let me talk about democracy. If you go back to Aristotle and Socrates, when they tried to establish democracy in Greece, they talked about how it's really important for citizens to be skeptical and to use their scrutiny, to not simply accept on its face every statement by a person in a position of authority. You have to ask them, how do you know? What makes you so sure? Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence that taking the vaccine, like vaccinating 100% of Canadians, will get us out of the pandemic, especially given that there are whole cohorts of people like, well, for example, in the States, the Center for Disease Control had a conference in either 2022 or 2023, and you can bet 100% of those CDC employees were vaccinated, and yet they had a huge outbreak where hundreds and hundreds got COVID. So if the vaccine isn't effective, and if you've got, according to the Health Canada data from last September, if 455 Canadians got the vaccine and then died, so it's not safe for some of us. So you need to be able to ask the questions, but instead we got this really the architecture of propaganda. And I think it's, I may not know my history entirely of Canadian politics, but I think that what happened in January and February of 2022 is a whole new scale of deception and propaganda that I don't think has ever been tried, at least this disingenuously, on the part of politicians to corral the Canadian public to side with them against our fellow citizens. And so this whole, featuring all these headlines to create shock and confusion and trauma, letting people know that the people protesting were Nazis and waving Confederate flags, and so January North, and calling people transphobic and mercenaries and insurrectionists and a feral mob and anti-Semites and all kinds of things. It just created for too many people. What happens is we turn on the news, we hear a shocking story, and most of us, unfortunately, simply think that all that we need to do then is repeat the story that we were told on the nightly news the night before, share it with our friends over a water cooler, on a walk along a trail, or at a restaurant or a cocktail party, and repeat it verbatim without any question at all about whether or not it's true.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Ray. Is what you're doing is challenging us to think critically that maybe, just maybe, the government is making a head fake or is actually lying to us. So you really have to look at this information and look at it critically. So I think that's a very important foundational principle for good citizenship. I agree with you, Ray. And on that note, I know that we're anticipating a book that you've written. I think that will be coming out in the next several weeks. So we're anticipating, because you're going to be talking about this history in great detail and talking about its lessons learned. So can you tell us a little bit more about that book?
Yes, well, the book is Unjustified: The Emergencies Act and the Inquiry That Got It Wrong. And I'm just working on, I'm going through the whole book now line by line before I send it to the typesetter probably next Wednesday. I'm waiting until, given all these bombshell stories coming out, like Tamara Leach and Chris Barber and others have a lawsuit against the government now, or Vincent Jerseys and Edward Cornell have a separate lawsuit against the government for violation of charter rights. All these stories are landing on me in the middle of getting the book to the typesetter. So probably a couple months, but it's looking at at the whole of what was the narrative in the mainstream media about the protests. Why did the Did the protesters go to Ottawa in the first place? What was the counter narrative that began to come out, questioning the claims of the media, for example, that the people in Ottawa had weapons in their trucks? That wasn't true. And then looking at the testimony at the public inquiry, the report that came out, and what happened at the Coutts blockade, and the trial of Tamara Leach and Chris Barber, and the judicial review. And it's all there. It'll be there for people probably to read in a couple of months. It'll take a bit of time for the typesetter, and we have to do the index.
Yeah, so that will be a landmark book, and we'll anticipate that quite a bit, Ray, and we'll certainly be promoting it and have you back on to do so. But within, this context, I mean, this is important history, and it really begs the question, what do we learn from this as Canadians? And I think what you said earlier is a very good insight, and that is, how do you how do you what do we do as citizens now? I mean, I think this is one of the questions that just came up in the chat is what should we as citizens do to kind of learn from this and prevent this from happening again?
Well, I am one of a number of people who are talking about this. I mean, there's people like Dr. Julie Ponesse, who was fired from uh, college in Ontario. There's Tamara Leach. There's Keith Wilson, who represented the Freedom Corp, a number of the protesters in Ottawa. Uh, I think that people can go to this particular podcast. They can go to other discussions that have happened online, uh, or look at a particular article raising questions about this, and have a conversation, in a kitchen or a cafe somewhere, with a friend or family member who could possibly be persuaded to revisit what happened, and to re-examine what we were told, because it's only going to happen, one person at a time. Because I think that there are some people who can be persuaded that maybe, because a lot of people have all kinds of stuff in their heads about, they think maybe that Parliament Hill was just a wash, and people with Nazi flags. And I think that it's shocking. I mean, initially, like for me, I mean, I thought, well, I guess there were Nazi flags there, and then I find out it was one or maybe two at the most, and then where they were, and hearing all these reports of people who never saw a swastika at all throughout the whole time they were there. So it's finding who the people are that we can have conversations with, because we need to shift public understanding about this, and I think it may take years or even decades for Canadians to come to terms with it, because we don't even necessarily consciously know this, but we do not believe that the media lies to us about big things. And in this case, they did. We also don't want to believe that when it's really important, and the stakes are high, that our politicians would also lie to us about what's going on. And also, people don't want to believe that they've been fooled. So there's also a personal psychology around, can we step back from our own investment in wanting to believe that our first impressions were right, and get enough detachment so we can come at it again with fresh eyes. And that will take some time.
No, I think you're right, Ray. I think it will take a considerable amount of time and work because people have been lied to. And I think people in power have a great responsibility. They are, people give them consent through trust that what the decision makers are telling us is by and large true. And of course, there's always healthy debate. But if you are spinning a yarn, you really do risk, I think, doing an immense amount of damage to our relationships, our social fabric. I think we all have stories where we had conversations with neighbors or friends who really did not understand what was going on, in my humble opinion, and you could have a debate about that. So at least you're debating. But in this case, I think too many Canadians have just simply gone on with their lives, understandably, and have hoped that this goes away and we kind of forget the history. And I think that would be a grave mistake, would it not, Ray? As we look at within a free and democratic country, how do we rebuild our institutions? Because when we look around us during this whole episode, we had a lot of institutions that failed us. We had people as ministers of justice who didn't, I would argue, do their job to uphold justice and to ensure that the truth came out. Or you had members of the media really carrying absurd stories like the CBC story suggesting that this was funded by the Russians. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I mean, it goes on and on and on. So that's where my prayer is, that we would take these lessons to heart so that we can never have this happen again, and that we can actually build a much stronger, healthy, democratic society.
Let me add a word of advice for people. I mean, this is really important, and we could all be tempted to go and find a friend or family member and just hammer them with all the evidence that they could get from reading several of my articles and other articles by other people like Gord McGill on Newsweek and so on. But the starting point really is to have a conversation about, would you be interested in having a conversation and with the person you want to talk with about like, it's been 2 years since the invocation of the Emergencies Act and all that happened. So, you know, what were your feelings about that? And very likely the person you're talking to is going to say, like somebody told me a few weeks ago, that they felt that the whole coverage was really scary, or made them really angry, or agitated, or indignant, disgusted, so on. You have to listen to that person tell you about why they felt like that. And it may take a while for them to unpack or get off their chest all their continuing upset about what that was. And then you can say, so, like if they bring up the Nazis, you could say, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that there were, a lot of Nazis, at Parliament Hill? Whatever they say, 10 being very strong or 5, I'm not so sure, but, and then say, would you be willing to reconsider, what would you accept as possible evidence to persuade you to look at it from another point of view, like, Rupa Subramania's posts as an Indo-Canadian woman freely going amongst the crowd, unhampered and unharassed, but there's no point in giving people a whole bunch of evidence if they are preemptively not going to allow any of it. So we have to be. We also have to remember that there's a friend that we have that we're talking to, and just like we wouldn't want them to just give us a whole bunch of stuff about, well, here's what Anthony Fauci says about why the vaccine is safe and effective, or here's what Dr. Theresa Tam is. We know what that feels like. It's been coming at us for 3 or 4 years now about what the mainstream media has been saying to us. So we're done, we're tired of that. So we don't want to do the same thing to them. We want to listen and then find out, what might be even one thing that we could share with them that they could consider. And they may not change their minds, but they might.
Well, I think that's very good advice, Ray McGinnis, and certainly the invitation to keep the conversation going as we try to get at the truth, but to also be tolerant and civil, dare I say, with grace, have these kinds of conversations. And that's part of being good citizens, is it not? And being able to be Canadians who live peacefully together in the same country. So I think that's historically been an incredible strength of this great country. So I think that's very good advice, Ray. And I want to thank you for joining me for this important discussion, as well as with our audience.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. And it's good to be talking about these important issues around the second anniversary of the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
Indeed. So be sure to look at Ray's writings and analysis, and we also anticipate the book that will be coming out over the next several weeks. And we are grateful that you could join us as an audience, and be sure to like us and share this conversation. Ray has spoken eloquently about the need to have conversations about this topic. So perhaps sharing this recording or this discussion with others might be a first start. So, regardless, we're grateful that everyone could join us, and be sure to join us next week. We have this discussion weekly. This is a special broadcast on this day. But every Thursday, we have the live discussion on X and YouTube. And again, be sure to join us and share this conversation with others. In the meantime, I trust that you have a great day over the next weekend.